Hello and welcome back to the Old Tech Bloke channel. Well, it's been a week since my first video went up and I've gained 14 subscribers, which I was quite surprised about. Thanks very much for the support. Hope this video is of interest as well. And there's been 108 views, so relatively successful, I think. Today I'm going to be continuing, it's episode 2 really, of creating a Linux desktop for YouTube video production. And I'm moving on to talk about software, starting with the installations of the operating systems that I installed on my Intel NUC. Now I should just say that although this is very much about what I did on the Intel NUC, a lot of what I cover today is going to be applicable for any sort of hardware if you want to set up a dual boot system. So I'm going to be setting up an Intel NUC with Windows 10 and also with Ubuntu 19.04. Now obviously I've already installed those operating systems on my NUC and I didn't want to start from scratch. So I'm going to go through the procedure that I followed using a virtual machine. That presented its own challenges. Not everything went that smoothly, especially as the Intel NUC is based on UEFI firmware rather than the traditional BIOS system. And so I set up the virtual machine to also run in UEFI mode. And there were a few issues which I've kept in for the sake of education, really. I don't think we should pull out what goes wrong. I've left in what goes wrong as well. But hopefully you'll enjoy what I'm going to produce and we'll see from there. So first things first, I've never actually installed an operating system in UEFI mode. Even though it's been around for quite some time, I tend to go with the traditional BIOS mode or legacy mode, as it tends to be called these days. But after doing some research, I read in a few places that the Intel NUC doesn't play that nicely with Windows 10 if installed in legacy mode. Intel also on their own website recommend that Windows 10 is installed in UEFI mode. So I thought, well, why not? Let's give it a go. So the first thing I did is I went into the Intel NUC's BIOS. I made sure that on the front screen, the boot order, I put a tick in the box where it says UEFI boot. And just to ensure that it did install in UEFI mode, I made sure that on the next tab I had disabled legacy boot. Finally, I double checked that secure boot was not ticked. The only thing I actually had to do was to make sure that legacy boot was disabled, because the defaults on the NUC were already set to UEFI booting. So with that done, and you just enter the BIOS screen by pressing F2 on booting, I then set up a virtual machine. I gave it 50 gigs of space and I went about getting hold of the ISO files. So on real hardware, if you have a DVD-ROM drive, it's relatively simple to download the ISO files and then burn them to traditional DVDs and boot from them to install your operating system. The Intel NUC does not have a DVD-ROM. The only way that you can install operating systems on it is to boot from a USB drive. What that means is you first have to create a bootable USB Windows installation, and you also have to create a bootable Ubuntu Mate USB drive. It's relatively straightforward. Windows presents the most problems, really, and I'll explain why in a second. First thing to do is to simply search for Windows Media Creation Tool. If you're doing this from a Windows operating system, which you may well be doing, what will happen is you'll be taken to a page which gives you the ability to download the Microsoft tool. You simply run it and you get the option to create an ISO file or to create a bootable USB stick. It's really simple. Use that if you're on Windows. If you're not on Windows, the page defaults, as you'll see from here, to simply selecting the version of Windows that you're after, and you'll be able to download a Windows 10 ISO. Microsoft seems to have eased up the whole process in the last few months. It used to be if you wanted to get a Windows 10 ISO from Microsoft, you had to enter your key, your license key, before they'd let you download it. But now it's not a problem. If you do download the ISO in Windows rather than using their media creation tool, that's fine as well. You can use a tool such as Rufus to automatically create your USB key. I'm just going to switch over to their webpage now. I believe it's free software. I've used it a few times. It seems pretty reliable. Now, you have a few problems in Linux. I've always created bootable USB sticks in Linux just using the DD command. But the way that the Windows ISO is structured prevents you doing that. However, there is, I've noticed on GitHub, a little program for Linux called Woe USB, which should allow you to burn the Windows 10 ISO to your USB stick. I'll be honest, I've not tried it. I've always done this in Windows myself. But hey, give it a go. So once you've got hold of a Windows ISO and installed it on a USB stick, the next stage is to download the Ubuntu Mate ISO. You can do this in Windows or Linux. Go to the Ubuntu Mate page. I downloaded 1904, the 64-bit version. You can use Rufus again if you're in Windows to install it on a USB stick, or you can use straightforward DD if you're in Linux. So you should have two USB sticks, both with bootable versions of operating systems. Before I show you the installation of both operating systems, there are bound to be people out there who are asking, well, why set up a dual boot system? If you're a Linux enthusiast, what on earth do you need Windows for? My answer to that is, it's really straightforward. I have to use Windows at work. The employer I work for is wedded to Microsoft Office. They're also wedded to OneDrive, Microsoft OneDrive. In fact, all of my desktop and documents are actually mapped to a commercial version of OneDrive. I know, but hey, that's the way it is. So it is just easier if I have a copy of Windows on my main machine, because I do work from home quite a lot. You may have your own reasons for wanting Windows on your system. Maybe you're a gamer and it's just easier for you. It doesn't really matter. I'm a Linux enthusiast, but I'm not an evangelist where I would say you have to use only one operating system. There are also a number of advantages of having Windows on your system. Not all SSD manufacturers produce programs where the SSD firmware can be updated. So it's quite handy having a copy of Windows sometimes. The same goes for updating BIOS versions. Intel are pretty good. You can get numerous different types of installation program for installing a BIOS that aren't operating system dependent. But nevertheless, just something to consider. So having got that out of the way, let's move on and look at the installation, starting with Windows. So you should now have your USB key with an installable and bootable version of Windows 10 on it. All you need to do is insert that USB key into one of the USB 3 slots on your Intel NUC, switch the machine on, hit the F10 key to bring up the boot menu, select the Windows 10 installer and follow along. You should install Windows 10 on the entire hard drive. Don't worry too much about leaving space for Ubuntu. We can figure that one out afterwards. What I'm going to do, however, as I already have Windows 10 installed on this machine, is to show you the process in a really useful program called Virtualbox. So I'm going to start the boot sequence of Windows 10 in Virtualbox now by hitting the start button. It asks me to boot from any key. Let me just make this larger and you'll see the Virtualbox boot screen coming up with your standard Windows 10 boot menu. It's already set to United Kingdom, so I'm just going to press next and install now. It does take a little while to install Windows, a lot quicker than it used to be on Windows 7 and Windows XP before it. However, what I will do is stop this recording halfway through. I just want to go through the main features that you'll see. You will initially get this screen asking you to enter a product key. Don't be worried about this at all. If you don't have a product key, you can always insert one after. All you need to put is I don't have a product key and it will continue to install. You then select the type of Windows 10 that you want. I always select Windows 10 Pro. I click next. You then have to accept the license terms. If you don't want to accept them, you won't be able to install Windows 10, so we haven't really got a lot of choice. You then have this little screen that says, what do you want to do? Do you want to upgrade an existing install, or do you want to install Windows only? Select the custom window. You'll see there that I've created a virtual hard drive of 50 gigabytes. I want to give all of that over to Windows 10, so I'm just going to click next. At which point, Windows 10 is going to start getting files ready for installation, installing its main features, installing updates, and getting ready for a reboot. I'm going to stop the recording now and come back once it's nearly finished. So Windows 10 has rebooted a couple of times and we are now at the screen that you see in front of you. Just a moment doesn't necessarily mean a moment when Windows is installing, especially on virtual hardware, but it is now setting itself up on that virtual hard drive, and you now get a little bit of interaction. So I'm just going to follow along. Let's start with region. Is this correct? Yes, United Kingdom. Do I also want to use a United Kingdom keyboard? Yes, I do. Thank you. Do you want to use a second keyboard layout? Skip that, please. We now have some important setting up to do. If you're on real hardware, this installer will actually talk to you and you can talk back to it. But as I'm in VirtualBox, that feature isn't really enabled. Right, so after multiple just a moments appearing on the screen, it's now asking us how we want to use the computer. Set it up for personal use, please, and hit next. Sign in with Microsoft. Now, this is completely up to yourself whether or not you want to use a Microsoft account. Personally, I don't want Microsoft to know all of my business, so I will always set up an offline account. It asks us again, sign up with Microsoft instead. No, thank you. Enter the name of the account that you want to use, hit next, Password, I would always create a password normally, but as I'm going to be deleting this instance of Windows 10 and Ubuntu once I finish, I'm just going to leave it passwordless for the time being. It then tells us a little bit about what it can do. Personally, I tend to select no for everything. Decline. The less Microsoft know about me, the better. Not because I've got anything in particular to hide. I just don't like the idea of being spied on at all. So I'll select no to everything. Accept. And now that it's asked all our questions, answered all our questions rather, it'll get everything ready for us, which shouldn't take too long, and it should take us straight into our Windows 10 screen. It might take several minutes, so I'll just pause this recording. And finally, here we are. Windows opens up with its default configuration, with its web browser Edge open to give you some ideas of what you can explore. So let me just shut that down, and you'll see Windows 10 has installed in its basic configuration. Because I'm using VirtualBox, there are no graphics drivers installed at the moment. However, I can install them later, but for now, just to show you what we have, if I click the Start menu, and type my PC or this PC, you'll see that I have a local disk there, 32.4 gigs, free of 49.3. So it's installed on this virtual hard disk as if it's a real hard disk. At this point, all we need to do is shut down Windows 10, and we can commence setting it up as a dual boot system. I'm just going to interrupt this recording because the next stage that I had intended was to simply attach the Ubuntu ISO to VirtualBox, to boot it, and to allow Ubuntu to identify the Windows installation and to offer me the option to install Ubuntu alongside Windows, and then to allow me to play a little bit with how much space Ubuntu was to take off Windows. That didn't happen, and there was much choice language during this process. I've put it down to the fact that on setting up a dual boot system on a UEFI system in VirtualBox, it's a little bit flaky, and it doesn't always work as planned. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. Ubuntu didn't recognise that Windows was there at all, and so it didn't offer me any options. So I had to go back into the Windows installation in order to shrink Windows a little bit. I could have cut this bit out, but it may happen in real life rather than just on virtual hardware. I do, however, have to say that for me, it worked great on real hardware. I only had this issue in VirtualBox. Nevertheless, I managed to resolve it, which I'm going to show now. So we've installed Windows 10. The next stage is to make room for Ubuntu. Now, normally the Ubuntu installer does this itself, but I've just tried simulating it and it didn't do it. My guess is it couldn't see a way to shrink the main Windows volume on VirtualBox. So we're going to help it out a little bit here. I've gone into Control Panel. I've selected Admin Tools. I'm now going to select computer management, and I'm going to go down to disk management. I can see there we have our C drive 49.37. I right click it and hit shrink volume. Enter the amount of space to shrink. Well, I think I only need about 20 gigs at most, and we've got to leave enough for Windows to continue, so I'm going to shrink. Total size after shrink 30. Fine. Click OK. This shouldn't take too long, and as you can see, that's left 19.53 gig unallocated space. So what we'll do now, we will go back to our Virtualbox. I'm going to shut down Windows 10 and we will install Ubuntu. So let's try this again. I've got Virtualbox up. I've highlighted the Windows 10 dual boot entry. I've attached the Ubuntu ISO disk to it. Let's click start and see what happens. Well, that's a good sign. We've got the Ubuntu grub screen has come up. And I'm booting it up to the live CD, or DVD should I say. This shouldn't take too long. And there we have it. I'm now going to double click install Ubuntu Mate. First thing it asks is the language that I want, and that's English. It should then ask us about the keyboard. It's set to US, but I want it to be set to UK. What apps would I like to install to start off with? Well, I'd like to do a normal installation. I would like to download updates while installing, and yes, I always want third-party software so I can install such things as music codecs, and if you're installing this on a machine with an AMD or an NVIDIA graphics card, you'll also want to hit this. Click continue, and it should now query the disk to see what's on it. Right. In actual fact, by creating that little bit of space, Ubuntu's now got the option to install Ubuntu Mate alongside Windows Boot Manager. So I've learnt something there. If you allow Windows to take up the entire disk and there's very little space on the virtual hard drive, you have to go in and make a little bit more. So I'm going to just hit install now and go with that option. If you continue, the changes listed below will be written to the disks. Okay, that's fine by me. Where am I? Well, if you're in the UK, unlike the US, as long as it's showing London, that's fine. It's all the same time zone. Your name. Well, I chose OBS last time for the open broadcasting system which I'm using. I'll choose the same thing. Choose a password. This time I will enter one, and I will confirm it. It's very short. Require my password to log in and continue. And Ubuntu Mate will now get on with the job of transferring files onto the hard drive. I'm going to pause this recording now while it finishes. Should only take 5 minutes, 10 minutes at most. Right, so took about 10 minutes at the outside. The installation has finished and I'm now being asked to restart. So I'm going to restart now, and hopefully what we should get up is the grub menu. Please remove installation medium, then press enter. Right, as you can see, the grub menu has indeed come up. We have Ubuntu there, and we also have an option for the Ubuntu Windows Manager. So far so good. Let's hit Ubuntu to make sure it starts. And there you go. Let me just reboot this now and select Windows in the grub menu to make sure that that starts as well. And there we go. The grub menu's come up again. This time I'm going to hit the Windows Boot Manager. Keeping fingers crossed here that everything works. And there we have it. The Windows 10 Login Manager has gone through automatically, and we have our Windows set up. So let me pause the recording. I'm going to go back into Ubuntu. I'm going to install what's called guest editions, which are the graphics drivers essentially that work in VirtualBox, and show you one final modification. So I've just installed the guest editions, and I've also installed a little program called Refind. What Refind does is it creates a graphical boot menu for UEFI systems. It's simply a case of sudo apt install Refind, and if I reboot now, you should see it in action. And there we have it, the Refind Boot Manager. There's an entry there for Windows. There's an entry there for the grub boot menu. A fallback bootloader from the UEFI system. And there's also a link to the kernel I have installed on Ubuntu. So, again, it just makes it look prettier. Ubuntu's launching no problem. And there we have it. So let me just pause this recording now, and we'll discuss what I've just done. So I've set up a dual boot system on the Intel NUC with Windows 10 and Ubuntu 19.04, and we have a nice graphical menu using Refind, which on the real system I've been using for several months now, and I've not had any problems with it at all. I like a little bit of bling here and there on the boot menu, so all good. Completely up to yourself whether you install it or not. Although I've been talking specifically about the Intel NUC here, the process that I've just been through is very, very similar to what you do on any other system. So if you want a dual boot system, this is how you do it, especially if you're going to use UEFI. I'm going to cut this episode short now because it's gone on for quite a long time. But next week, the video will specifically look at OBS Studio. It'll also look at Kdenlive and a couple of modifications that I've made to the C920 webcam to be able to set up broadcasts. It's taken quite a while to produce this video. I've done it in stages throughout the week. And I think using VirtualBox to illustrate the whole process has extended the time it actually took, because when I did it in real life, it didn't take long at all. But hopefully it'll be of some use. I'll leave the comments open, and if you'd like to make any suggestions about how I could improve the process, they'll be very welcome. But for now, thank you very much. Thank you for watching the Old Tech Bloke channel, and see you next week.